we are going to talk about honor and shame. Honor and shame. The guy on the screen is a famous Japanese novelist. He was named Yukio Mishima. Yukio Mishima. And he lived from 1925 to 1970. How he died, though, is why we're talking about him. Even though he was a very famous man, he was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, but he died after he tried to lead a rebellion against the new Japanese constitution. He tried to lead a rebellion so they would not adopt it, but they did. And when they did, because of his public failure, he was so ashamed that he committed ritual suicide. Public school teachers have committed suicide, ritual suicide, in Japan for mispronouncing the emperor's name publicly. Or when their school burned down, they failed to run in and grab the emperor's portrait before it could burn. In June of 1871, the U.S. Marines invaded Kangwa-do, an island off the coast of Korea. The U.S. won that fight, and in the process, they captured over 100 Korean soldiers. Now, what they were going to do with those soldiers, and they told them this, was they were going to return them to their families. But as they were marching, several of these soldiers, scores of them, committed suicide by jumping off of cliffs or cutting their own throats. And the ones who didn't commit suicide were begging the Marines to do it for them, to kill them. Now that's weird to us, but for them, it was all about honor and shame. Because if they died in battle, if their enemy killed them, then their family would remember them as honorable for generations. But if they returned home, even alive, but if they returned home humiliated, their families would never recover from the shame. Now those concepts, those images, for us may seem like remnants of an ancient samurai warrior type of idea, but they very much extend to the modern day. Even in the past few years, several incidents have been reported by the media of people who've disappeared or been murdered or mutilated, and the people who did these things, it's known who did them, but they either get off free or receive extremely light punishment because they committed those crimes, at least in our minds, they committed those crimes as an act of redeeming their family's honor, of revenging some shame that was brought on their family. Now, just this warning, this is about to be very squeamish, at least for me. I'm a squeamish person, so if you don't like that kind of thing, if you don't like blood, you might want to tune out for the next 30 seconds. I'll tell you when to come back in. But I do want to say it because it's so serious for people that are in those cultures, and it's tough for us to understand how serious it is. So for one example, Kifaya Hussein, I'm probably saying her name wrong, but Kifaya Hussein, who was a 16-year-old girl from Jordan. I won't get into the details, but essentially she was brutally murdered by her own brother. 16 years old, brutally murdered by her own brother. And her crime was that she had gone through something with a man, had done something to her, right, that he shouldn't have done. And that act brought shame onto her family. And so her own brother murdered her for that act. This is the part that I particularly did not enjoy, even more so than the rest. After he murdered her, he took the knife with the blood on it and he ran down the streets, crying out, "I have killed my sister to cleanse our honor." One more example, a 25-year-old Palestinian man killed his own sister, and he said that he didn't want to kill her, but that he did it to wash, this is a quote, to wash with her blood the family honor that was violated, and in response to the will of society that would not have had any mercy on me if I hadn't. He did it to cleanse her honor. Now, if you tuned out, tune back in. We're done with that part, thankfully, for me and everybody else. But I wanted to tell you that because anybody who listened to that, you can see how seriously Eastern cultures, shame-based cultures, take shame, honor, and shame. Now, that type of mindset is mysterious to us, at least to me. I don't understand that. That's not in my vocabulary of how I look at life. And what's difficult here is that our culture really runs on a guilt and innocence dynamic. Whereas these cultures run in an honor-shame type of dynamic. So we're crossing cultures here. And what I've learned is that we really don't even have language to describe in English what these cultures are going through. We can just do the best that we can. And that's what we're going to try to do tonight. And next time I preach, we'll really hammer this home. But tonight's going to be a kind of historical, almost overview, trying to understand where this is coming from. And this is particularly important because of this part right here. So this is kind of our three-part outline for this time and next time. First, we'll talk about us, just really briefly, our culture and what our culture is like when it comes to this. Then we'll talk about them. So that's primarily shame-based cultures. And this last part here is why this matters. Because the culture of first century Palestine was very much a shame-based culture, an honor and shame-based culture. And if you know anything about the setting of the New Testament, you know that it came to us from first century Palestine, right? And I think what you'll see, what I'm discovering in this study, is that when you read it through those lenses, the lens of an honor and shame culture, you'll see things that you never noticed before in the New Testament. So we'll get there. But first, really quickly, let's talk about us, our culture. In our culture, my self-formation is really important. My individual self-formation is very much important. For us, we think of maturation as growing up and being able to discern for myself right and wrong, right? We tend to think of our culture in terms of my growth. It's not necessarily even a selfish thing for us. It's just I can't bless everyone around me if I myself am not growing up, if I'm not mature, right? It's very much an individualistic type of mindset. We have proverbs like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Now that's just normal for us, but for someone in a shame-based collective culture, that's very strange. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is in the eye of the community. It's what the community thinks is beautiful. That's what's beautiful. But for us, we respect that I might think something is beautiful. You might think something else is beautiful, right? So we have proverbs like that. And even this phrase right here, follow your heart. It's one of the biggest proverbs and guidelines in our culture today. There are a lot of things that we could say about it, good and bad. But either way, aside from all of that, just think about how individualistic this is. It's about following my personal heart. It's not about everyone around me. It's not even necessarily selfish, like I'm trying to hurt the people around me. It's just follow your heart, right? And even the U.S. Army, which is maybe the organization in our culture which needs teamwork the most, has used slogans like these. An army of one, and be all that you can be. Be all you can be. Now, both of those slogans are very much focused on the individual, right? Now, the hope is that those individuals will help the collective. But just notice how individualistic those slogans are. For us, we think of morality as some kind of objective standard where right and wrong exists outside of us, but we're supposed to internalize that, right? We might think of this as being convicted by our consciences. So if someone has a conscience that's not convicted with something we all think should be convicted, we think of them as immature. If they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing according to our objective right and wrong standards, we think of them as immature. Not necessarily shameful people. We do think of them as that. But we first start with they don't have this internal moral compass. Where is their moral compass guiding them? We wonder. So that's a symptom, and I'm not saying it's a bad symptom, but it's a symptom of our culture that focuses on individual growth and individual acknowledgement of this external standard, right? So we presume that because we're supposed to be guided internally to do the right thing, we also should be punished internally if we don't do the right thing. We call this guilt, right? Where if I don't do the right thing, I'm supposed to feel that on the inside. My conscience should be convicted. This is Edgar Allan Poe's short story called A Telltale Heart. A Telltale Heart. And in this story, the narrator tells the reader about how he murdered this old man that lived with. This has been a dark sermon so far. I'm sorry for that. But how he murdered this elderly man whom he lived with. And he really had no reason for it, but he murdered him and buried him under the floorboards of his own room. And there was no evidence left. It was the absolutely perfect crime. He had gotten away with it completely. But what happens toward the end of this short story, I think we all understand. Because even though he had gotten away with it, he couldn't get away from it. Even though he was not going to receive any external punishments, his conscience wouldn't let him go. He was getting hallucinations of this man's heartbeat beating in his ears, in his mind. He couldn't get away from his conscience. In our Western culture, that's a symptom of our Western culture. We typically assume that our wrongdoings will find us out because we can't get over our conscience. Now that's us. Let's focus on them for the rest of our time. We primarily rely on an internalized conviction of sin. And a lot of that goes back to our love for independence. We think of independence as a good thing. It's good to grow up and be independent. It's good to make your own decisions, right? On the other hand, there's a well-known Japanese proverb that says, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. So for them, independence is not a good thing. Being different than everybody else is not a good thing. You're supposed to fit in with the culture around you, and especially your family. You're supposed to fit in with your community. You're supposed to rely on each other. So for them, they rely mainly on external punishments for bad behavior. And not necessarily imprisonment or anything as formal as that. More so just embarrassment and exclusion and shame and abandonment. So whereas guilt, our culture, is more about right and wrong, for them, shame, their culture is more about lowering your status in the community. It's about lowering your status with the people that you care about. Now, the actions that we're talking about, or actions that we might take, for them, they are mainly motivated by some inner drive to do right or wrong. That's involved, but it's mainly not to bring shame on yourself, your village, your tribe, your faith, your church. Don't bring shame on those entities. So that's what matters most, the expectations of the people around you, especially your family. And it's not that they matter more than what's right or wrong, but it's that what they expect is right. What they expect you not to do is wrong. It's very different for us. We think of a kind of abstract standard, whereas for them, it's very much real. It's very much in their culture, in their community. So you do wrong, not by doing something and experiencing inner guilt by breaking a law, but by letting down your community. Now, hang with me. This is all going somewhere. But the differences here are really stark. And we don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. We absolutely have honor and shame in our culture, right? And they absolutely have guilt and innocence in theirs. But the overriding concerns for our culture are guilt and innocence, and for their culture are honor and shame. So this goes so far, and this is weird to us, but this goes so far that if a person in this type of culture commits what we would think of as a sin, if nobody else knows about it, he's not going to feel guilty at all. From what I've read from people who've worked in these cultures, people who've lived in these cultures, not even like deep down, right? I might expect that. I mean, if you did something really wrong and nobody knows about it, deep down, you're going to feel it somewhere. But for them, it's not really about that. It's about bringing shame on yourself or your family. It's about bringing shame on those people, from people who you actually care about, from the expectations of the culture. This is a little bit of an example, taking this to ancient times. This is the mythical ring of Gyges, the ring of Gyges. The idea is that this ring is the one temptation that no one could resist. Plato talks about this, and if this is going to sound familiar if you've seen the Lord of the Rings series, because J.R.R. Tolkien took this concept and put it into use. But the idea behind this ring and the ring of Gyges is that if you put this ring on, you can't be seen by anybody. You're invisible. And so you can do whatever you want. Now put this concept in that culture, right? Remember that for them, right and wrong is determined by shame, by people around me thinking that what I've done is wrong. So if nobody can see you, if nobody can shame you for something bad that you've done, well, you feel no guilt for it, so might as well do it. So this ring was the one temptation that no one could resist. Philosophers talked about this thousands of years ago. Because if nobody could shame you for something, then it wasn't wrong. So they would seek after this ring of Gyges. So the temptation was so strong because this inner code that we have was not there for them. And for a lot of us, you may be sitting there thinking what I've been thinking as I read about this. And it's very strange. It's confusing to us because it's so very different. But the people who come from cultures like this think of us as the confusing ones, right? We might tend to think of them as being on a lower ground morally. Like we may think that we have the moral high ground here. But they would think of us as insensitive, as not caring about the people around us. And the point here isn't to discuss which of these is superior or right and wrong. It's just to show that there are several differences here that are notable. Because even though our society is more guilt-based, the society of the New Testament was more shame-based. And this is where we're going. Because someone who was born into the first century Mediterranean world, Jewish or Gentile, whatever they were, if they were born into that world, they were trained from childhood to seek honor and to avoid disgrace at all costs. You seek honor and you avoid shame. If you look in ancient proverbs, ancient books of right and wrong, you'll see it classified not necessarily as right and wrong, but as noble and as disgraceful. Noble, honorable, and disgraceful, shameful. So those were really the categories that they were working with. Disgrace was a powerful motivator, but so was honor. Honor was an incredibly powerful motivator for them. And for them, this concept was so serious that if someone dishonored your name or your family, if something was offended in that, then it was just kind of universal that could not be fixed without the shedding of blood. It's that serious. We saw that it still extends to today, right? But it was just as serious back then, where blood was required to make right that shame, that dishonor. It's incredibly serious for them. And you can see this type of honor and shame thinking all over the New Testament. I'll just give you a preview tonight, and we'll really break this down and bring it home to our lives next time. But for tonight, a bunch of verses are going to come at you real quick. So don't try to take it all in, but just see that this is all over. And if you put these lenses on, I think you'll understand some things in the New Testament a little bit better. So the first example here is John 12 and verse 26. John 12:26. Jesus says, "If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him." Now, that still applies in our culture, right? We still have honor and dishonor in our culture. But just think about how serious this was for them. How much of an honor, how much of a reward this would be for them. Philippians 2:29 and 30. "So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ." He had earned their honor. Honor him because he nearly died for the work of Christ. One more example, and this one doesn't actually use the word honor, and I picked it for that reason on purpose. So glorify God in your body, 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 20. Glorify here is what we're focusing on. Because honor is a concept that I think we understand. We understand that people are honored. But for a lot of us, we don't necessarily know what glory is, what glorifying somebody is. That's kind of an abstract concept for a lot of us. But what you might want to do in your New Testament when you read the word glory or something along those lines is insert honor. It's not the same exact concept, but it helps a lot, for me at least, in understanding. Glorify God in your body, honor God in your body. Let's think of this from their perspective. Honor comes from the community that's around you. What's honorable and dishonorable is determined by what the community thinks, right? So what Paul is saying here is God is the community that is supposed to determine what's honorable and dishonorable for you. Honor him in your body, because what he determines as right and wrong, what he determines as shameful and honorable, is what counts. So honor him. Now, we also can see these dynamics. You really should see it everywhere if you learn to look for it. So in Luke chapter 14, we've talked about that a lot this year. Luke 14. You remember the parable where Jesus talks about taking the lowest seat? And if you take the lowest seat, you'll be elevated to the highest seat. And he warns against taking the highest seat, because if you take the highest seat and someone who's more honorable comes in, you'll be demoted to a lower seat, and you'll bring shame on yourself, on your family. Now, we don't necessarily understand that parable. At least I didn't, because it seems weird to me to seek honor for yourself. Like that seems against our message as Christians. But for their culture, it makes sense. Take the lowest seat, and then God will exalt you to the highest one. And you see this in Jesus' life. And that's Paul's argument in Philippians chapter 2, where he says, have this humility in your mind, right? So humble yourself, just as Jesus humbled himself, shamed himself. And then God will exalt you, just like he exalted Jesus. So you see these honor and shame dynamics over and over and over again. And you even see this in how the society that surrounded Christians pushed back on these new Christian communities. They shamed them for their new lives. One example is 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 4, which says that they are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. So the persecution that first century Christians endured wasn't mainly physical. That came later. But it wasn't mainly hurt on their bodies. It was simply shaming them. It was disgracing them in front of their communities. Now, these were their society's attempts to bring those believers back into an acceptable life, back in line with the traditional values of that culture. Now, just imagine what this verse might have looked like in real life. Imagine that you are living in that culture and you convert to Christianity. And now, well, your life's going to change, right? Because you've been living as an idolater your whole life. You've been worshiping these idols in the culture. And now imagine that, just like we have holidays that come around the same time every year, festivals, they had the same thing, probably more so than we do. So imagine that the festival of Zeus, I have no idea if that's real, but just imagine that the festival of Zeus comes around this year. And your friends come to you and they're trying to plan this festival of Zeus that you've always attended, you've always had a great time at. But you say, listen, guys, I'm a Christian now. I can't participate in celebrating this idol this year. I'm living a different life now. And they start to make fun of you. Like, really? You're too good for us now? Like, it's something you've always enjoyed. Like, you want to go. Good food, fireworks going to be set off and everything. But you can't because of your new life. And the persecution that you endure for that is what Peter talks about here. They'll shame you. They look down on you. They heap abuse on you because you don't join them in their wild, reckless living. And the same thing was true of Jews. If you look at Acts 5 and verses 40 and 41, you'll see that these people beat the apostles, charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus, let them go. Then the apostles left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. Now think about that. Given how serious this was for them, given the life and death seriousness with which they took honor and dishonor, how radical is this? The apostles rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for Jesus' name. They rejoiced that their culture looked down on them, kicked them out for their faith. Now for us, that's the takeaway that I know this has been very historical, maybe dry for a lot of you. I love this stuff, but maybe dry for a lot of you. And it will get more practical next week. But I want the takeaway that I want you to walk away with is that their culture was very antagonistic toward them. And I think you'd be pretty blind to say that our culture is not getting more antagonistic toward Christians, right? So as our culture moves more toward heaping abuse on Christians and shaming us for our beliefs, I want you to keep in mind this principle right here. And also the principle that we find in Romans chapter 8 and verse 17, which says that we are heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him, in order that we may also be glorified with him, honored with him. Remember in Philippians chapter 2, where Paul says that Jesus empties himself. He shames himself for us. And because of that, God has exalted him. He's honored him. Now for us, like Paul says here, we want to follow in Christ's footsteps. We are his disciples. So as we maybe begin to suffer some verbal persecution, at least in our culture, just think of it as suffering alongside Christ. Think of it like Paul does here. This is, if you see this is, again, all over the New Testament. Suffering in Christ's sufferings. We're suffering alongside him. We take the shame, and we're honored by God because of it. So please, the one takeaway is just the suffering that you might undergo for being a Christian, whether you're already suffering or in the future we might suffer some for being shamed. Think of it as honor, because it is honor from God's perspective, and his perspective is the one that really matters. All right, we'll continue this next week, and we'll take this to the cross and talk more about Jesus and his honor and dishonor for us. But tonight, we have an opportunity that we do this multiple times every week, but it really is a golden opportunity where you're in the midst of God's people. And if you have something you need to make right, if you have something that you need to be ashamed of before God, you need to be honored by him, you need to be cleared by him, then won't you please do that as we stand.